Hi, this is Bob Schmidt. Now I've made a couple of videos on architectural skeleton clocks, but this is a 5-minute express version made to attract those who may not have considered clockmakers' efforts to make either the case or the movement of a clock replicate a landmark, palace, or church. We begin in England, in the city of York. Now this site has been a place of worship for over 2,000 years. The official name of this church is the Cathedral of St. Peter in York, or York Minster. Here is a daytime view from the south, and here we have an evening view from the west. And here is an engraving from around 1850, taken from the northwest corner of the cathedral. And here is a daytime view from the west. And here the clock itself, an Evans striking skeleton clock in the form of York Minster, made in the factory near Birmingham in the Soho district. Here's another Evans, this a triple fusee 8-bell quarter chimer in the form of York Minster. And another striker, this one with a black rectangular base for a glazed cover instead of a dome. Like most 2 fusee skeletons, you see the dark gong for counting the hours and the bell at the top for the half hour. Here's a third 8-bell chimer, this one presented to the Reverend J.W. Stafford in 1862. And here's a fourth 8-bell chimer in York Minster frame with minor variations in the dial and collet detail. Here's a close-up showing the corner of the frame canted to 45 degrees and other minor variations. Now Smith & Sons of Clerkenwell began the production of skeleton clocks shortly after observing the response to Evans clocks. Their approach stressed extra detail, thinner dials that were finely fretted, and often a trigger strike mechanism. They were only 2/3 the size of an Evans clock and made with great detail. Here's another example of a Smith's York Minster with a plaque at the bottom signed Smith & Sons. And here's a close-up showing the dial detail, cutout snail, and the trim on the spring setup ratchets. Here's an image of Westminster Abbey at Dean's Yard, London, the burial place of both Thomas Tompion and George Graham. Here's another view from directly across the street. Note the facade has been cleaned for a royal wedding, so it appears white. Here's a Westminster Skeleton, and it's produced by Evans, a double fusee with gong at the hour. Here's another Westminster frame, striker by Evans with a later glazed cover. Here's an 8-bell chimer in Westminster frame. Note the 4 separate plates. Here we have another 8-bell quarter chimer by Evans. Notice the solid chapter ring and dial. This is the normal one that appears. Here's still another, this a presentation gift to a public servant. See the plaque at the bottom. Finally, an uncommon single fusee timepiece. You rarely see this as a time only. This brings us to the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, England. This palace was built in the late 1700s as a seaside retreat for King George IV. See the influence of India and the Middle East on the unusual architecture. The theme that you see here in the middle will be repeated on the clock, which is coming up in the next slide. Here is the Smith & Sons Brighton skeleton clock with fancy fretted dial. Here is a Brighton skeleton with eagle and lions. Notice the shape to the top of the clock. Here's another nicely restored Brighton Pavilion skeleton clock. And here's a presentation Brighton skeleton clock. Note the stand under the eagle is a quarter turn out. Note the fine floral border around the dial and the fretted snail and the cocks. All fine work on a Brighton. Here's a rear view from an auction hall showing a Brighton model. This brings us to the cathedral at Lichfield in Staffordshire, England, with 3 prominent spires. Here's a view from the rear showing the larger central spire, and a daytime view from the nave. Here's a drawing from the Smith's catalog in 1865 showing the frame details, and here's the clock itself with Smith's pattern showing the fine detail. Here's the Smith's dial showing the extra detail. And here's an early version of Smith's Lichfield Cathedral, this one with a simpler frame that does have a quarter-hour strike bell. And here's an unknown maker retailed by Bennett, still a simple frame, Lichfield. Another unknown maker with a simple pattern frame. And here we have a still simpler frame with a 3-step base but with spoked spring barrels. And here's the simplest Lichfield I have seen with a single step base. Now this brings us to St. James Palace, Marlborough Road, London. Here's a closer view from directly in front of the palace. And here's the clock itself, St. James clock by Evans, sometimes called the Queen Victoria model. Here's a second clock on a marble base, clearly showing the gilt statue of Queen Victoria. Notice the porcelain dial, which is typical of this model. And here you see all three parts to the frame set, the dials carried by the castle-like frame in the front. Here is Sir Walter Scott Monument, Princess Street in Edinburgh, Scotland. Here is Princess Street Gardens, another view of the same monument. And here is the clock itself, Sir Walter Scott Double Fusee by W.F. Evans circa 1855. And here's an early Scott Memorial clock with brass cylinder pendulum. Note Sir Walter and his dog there in the nave. And here's a circa 1860 Scott Memorial clock with a lever escapement. And here's another 24-inch clock with a large dial. See the double-ended fan governor. Evans produced a timepiece, smaller, around 16 inches high. The statues were the same size. This brings us to the 10th century St. Paul's Cathedral that burned. Here's the late 17th century version designed by Sir Christopher Wren. And here's a modern view to the St. Paul's Cathedral clock itself, about 1875. This came only as a 3-train, chiming the quarters on 8 bells. Here's another example of the St. Paul's, probably the most elaborate cathedral clock produced by Smith & Sons. Here's the detail of the 13-inch dial. Note crowns beyond each numeral and the elaborate workmanship throughout. See the fretted tails and cocks on St. Paul's and the elaborate hands. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you for watching. Please like us on YouTube and subscribe.